Hey guys, my name is Mannequin, and today we're going to look at the difference between what sort of sound you get when you're using outboard analog gear to kind of get that cassette track degradation versus using a plugin to try to get the same effect. So, first things first, let me explain what we're going to be using today. So, I have a electric guitar that was directly recorded into my audio interface, and then we have a drummer from Logic just because I wanted something that covered a little bit more of the frequency spectrum. Because a guitar doesn't really have much bass and doesn't really have much high end. So this is Sketch Cassette 2. Normally it's $30. Right now it's on sale for $20. Overall, it's in the lower price category for plugins. So this is what we'll be using today. And in terms of outboard hardware, I'm going to be using a Sony TCM-818. And that is going to be recorded onto Maxwell Type 1 cassettes, I think. Yeah, IEC Type 1 cassettes. I don't really know the difference between a lot of that stuff, but what I do know is that the Sony TCM-818 does not have Dolby noise reduction, which is critical to mention because this recorder is very low quality. It is not intended to be used in any sort of studio. It wasn't even intended to, create good cassettes that you could listen to in a hi-fi sense from back in the day. This cassette recorder is really just for the purpose of replacing what we now have as digital handheld recorders. And it was intended to kind of be used in the sense of just something that can record things in a consumer-friendly way. So once again, not high quality whatsoever. So without further ado, I think it's time to kind of just get into what you all want to hear. What happens when we take a source track and apply cassette signal degradation to it? And is there a difference between the two? How much of a difference is there? So let's go ahead and look at these different tracks here. Just a quick high-level overview. This is the source track. This is recorded with a cassette. No microphones involved, just straight line in, line out. And this is just the regular track here, but with the effect applied. And I've also added another noise synthesizer behind it that I will explain why I did that in a minute. So here we go. Let's take a listen. Now, one of the things that I want to point out initially is the biggest difference between the two, and that is the noise. You probably didn't hear a difference because I was using this. This was a custom designed, but still all digital, all in the box background noise. So what I did was I basically just got a white noise oscillator and then boosted the low end a lot and did a very drastic cut to the high end. I did not roll off all the high end, you'll notice. If I actually offset this, you could see it is very critical you don't just do a low pass filter, high cut, and bring that all the way down here because you'll lose a lot of frequencies that still need to be present. I just, cut them down drastically. So they're still there, just much reduced. And then what I did was I applied a match EQ to my source. So this is something that if you don't have, an analog cassette recorder that you could sample noise from, that you won't be able to do. But this is kind of what it got out of it. And then the final thing I did was I applied distortion. When you distort this signal, what happens is it adds more to the high frequencies that you'll kind of notice in the original recording as well. So this is a little bit of an important step. It changes the character of by pushing some of the low frequency energy into the high end in a way that has like a little bit of variance. So that's how I got this sound, which is very similar to our cassettes. There's just a level difference there because I haven't level matched this one. So it's very similar actually. And the reason I had to do this was because as much as I like Sketch Cassette 2, its hiss doesn't really match the recorder I'm using. So if we mute this guy here and then add our own hiss, this is what happens here. Actually, I could turn this all the way up, and it still is not quite sufficient. So you'll notice it's a very stale hiss. It doesn't have a lot of low end, and it also doesn't have some of that low end distorting and getting pushed up into the high end. So that's one thing to consider there. That's the reason that I decided to go this route instead of just using the built-in hiss. So that's the biggest difference. There were two other very minor differences that I heard when listening to these tracks, and one of them will be emphasized when we start to look at the drums. The first one is the kind of dynamics. I noticed that there's a lot more dynamics to the recording that went through the actual analog cassette recorder. When it goes through this plugin, it loses a little bit of its punch, and it becomes a lot more kind of squished together. This could be a thing that's kind of just based on gain staging, because gain staging is very critical for all of these. Depending on what level you send out to the analog recorder, you will get a very different sound coming back out of it. And the exact same thing with this plugin. It kind of has some internal saturation and compression and stuff that you have to control by changing the level of the signal that goes in. Even still, I heard there was a slight difference in dynamics. This will be more pronounced in the drum example. Okay, so what was the other big difference? The other big difference was these kind of pitch modulation knobs here. So basically what they do is they kind of simulate a poor stability in terms of playback speed. So you'll kind of get this warble to your track. This one sounds more like a unstable track or an unstable playback speed. This one sounds a little bit more like a pitch warble. Now, what you can do is you could use both of these in tandem, but the thing is, it's not an oscillation behavior that you get there. There's a little bit of oscillation, but also part of it is just like an inherent lack of playback stability because it's analog hardware that is not designed for studio use. So, and that variance is a little bit harder to reproduce quite as well. You kind of have to work a little bit to get these. I didn't quite get it right. Okay, so I spent a little bit more time trying to dial things in, and this is as close as I think I could get it. I just added a tiny bit of the LFO on the right. It's also a sine, but it's at a much higher frequency. And then I added a tiny bit of dropouts as well. And this is our difference. Note that this is not off. This is just on a very, very, very small amount. You have to be very careful because one of the things that that kind of happens with this one is because there's just something about like the way that it's a very hard sine wave makes it stick out a little bit more when you start to mix at lower volumes, which is the reason I had it so low in terms of the depth. So yeah, tonally, they actually sound extremely similar, and I'm very impressed. So there's like a mid-range boost, high frequencies are cut off a little bit. It definitely has a shift in tone. And you have a whole bunch of different tone options that you could kind of try to mix and match and get it closer. Cool. So this is our first example. Our second example will be faster. Not because the clips are shorter, they're actually longer, but because we have roughly the same learnings from this. One thing to note is instead of using a synthesized noise, for this one I actually just used some tape recorder hiss that I sampled off. I'm choosing to bring in my own noise from a separate source because I don't feel like the plugin's internal noise generator is configurable enough. I feel like they should have different tone options. So without further ado, let's take a listen to these and come back with some thoughts. I noticed a couple things here. First of all, one of the key things you probably noticed was halfway through the clip, the volume of the recording actually changes. And I don't believe this is because of anything I touched. I think this was just because there's some weird behavior of my cassette recorder where when you have the line level low for a while, what happens is when you start to feed it a signal, it gets very hot for a little bit and then it kind of normalizes to a lower volume. So this is something that we saw a little bit emphasized here, where the first half is very loud and the second half is kind of quiet. So unusual behavior. Maybe that was just my operation error. I'm not entirely sure, but it is something to observe. Other than that, the dynamics are much more pronounced here in the sense of if you listen to the snare on the track with a plugin, things sound the snare drum sounds like it rings a lot. And it sounds much tighter in this clip. Once again, reiterating our findings from before, the plugin doesn't have quite as good dynamics. And also one thing I would like to point out, this is possibly because I'm using this, which is part of what lets me get the tone that I'm looking for. If I turn this off completely, it's possible we'd get more dynamics, but hold on. I think there's a potential that this is what's adding that that kind of sustain and pulling away from the dynamics a little bit. So that's one thing you consider. But like I said, this is a huge part of the tone for this particular setup that I have. In order to actually get things to match correctly, I had to turn this on to try to get that brightness where the cassette recorder I have was, creating a much larger peak in the kind of high mids. Oh, I almost forgot. One more thing I wanted to point out was in this recording, you could hear some of the internal noises of the cassette recorder. It's not like a totally smooth noise profile. So let me actually take a sample of this and you can listen. You kind of, in addition to the white noise, you could kind of hear a scratching sound. That kind of comes in and out a little bit. I think it would be really cool to in Sketch Cassette, if we could have something similar where we could just kind of introduce internal device noise into the recording to kind of get that sort of crackling that you would get with vinyl, except for in the same way a cassette recorder kind of has that. And if we could introduce that as well, that would be really cool to have as a feature on this. But that's not there. So I think that was the last thing I wanted to point out. So that's pretty much all I've got to show off today in terms of like demonstrations. I think the one thing I'd like to leave you with is I have a cassette recorder and I can connect it and do these things directly. And I could potentially get a quote, better cassette sound. The problem is I don't think I'll do that any more than, maybe to get some noise or some very rare cases where I want something to sound very poor quality. The problem is it's very tedious to set up because I have to have the source material and then I have to feed it into the recorder. Then I have to record. Then I have to rewind. And then I have to rewire things to make it go back into my audio interface and then play it back and record it in my actual DAW. So it's not practical to do this regularly. It's more like a very rare occasion you want to really get that analog sound like it was on a cassette recorder, and you can do that. But I think for most practical purposes, in terms of musical composition, it's just way more practical to put it as a plugin onto something. And that allows you to also strictly control the amount of noise that you have in your final sound. And most of the plugins work ends up being to get that tone that you want, and that the tape lack of stability in its playback, how it can kind of warble a little bit. So I'll probably be using the plugin a lot more than anything else. But it is cool to experiment with these things and actually see a one-to-one comparison. What does it look like when you actually get in and record it and take a listen to them? is it worth going for the plugin at all? If you would like me to do a deeper dive into Sketch Cassette, I would totally be game to. I don't have enough time in this video, but if you're interested, please leave a comment down below, and I'll actually talk through some of the things that this plugin can do. If I ever get my hands on a cassette recorder that has Dolby noise reduction, then I'll probably redo this video and see if we could actually get it to match a better quality cassette recorder that might have different characteristics to the way it records. But anyway, that's all I've got for you today. If that was helpful, feel free to leave a like. You could subscribe. I don't post videos too often, but I'm hoping to post more in the near future. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.